this guide, we'll go over all of the actions the Scholar learns from level 50 to 90 in order. We'll go over how each action is meant to be used and when applicable, the recommended way to use it. In the summary, we'll take time to outline both an opener as well as some tips and tricks for general use of the healing toolkit and finally cover stat priorities. Please be aware that this guide assumes you have some preliminary knowledge as listed here. Relevant videos can be found in the description or the top right corner. Before we go through new actions, let's briefly cover changes introduced with Endwalker. Ruin and all its upgrades now have a cast time of 1.5 by default. This enables you to weave a single OGCD after every cast, which is a massive upgrade. Aetherflow, the ability, grants a lot more mana on use, but energy drain no longer gives any. Overall, this should result in more mana for you. Art of War's mana cost has been reduced to be equal to Ruins, so using Art of War repeatedly no longer will cause any bigger mana issues than regularly attacking. Additionally, Art of War's damage is slightly higher than Ruin 2, so if you need the mobility but happen to be in melee range, you can use Art of War in place of Ruin 2. Now then, at level 52, you learn the ability Indomitability, which is an AoE Aetherflow spender. It is better than Lustrate if at least 2 players benefit from it. Keep in mind that it has a cooldown, so there may be reason to hold on to it if you know there is a better opportunity coming up in a moment. At level 54, you learn the trait Broil Mastery, which upgrades Ruin to Broil, as well as boosts the potencies of Ruin 2 and Art of War. You should still use Art of War on 2 or more targets. At level 56, you learn the ability Deployment Tactics. When used on a player, it copies your Galvanize effect on them to all other party members near them. Deployment Tactics can spread both a leftover Succor shield or an Adlocuium shield. If used on a target after Adlocuium critically healed, it will not also spread the Catalyze. A convenient time to use Deployment Tactics is just before pulling a boss. Use Adlocuium on the tank and spread the shield to everyone else. The reason to use it on the tank first is that if the Adlocuium happens to be a critical heal, then the Catalyze will benefit the player most likely to take damage. Sometimes you can go for a long time without using this ability due to its rather complex nature. At level 58, you learn the ability Emergency Tactics. If you need to use Adlocuium or Succor to heal the party, but you know for a fact that the shields will go to waste, or perhaps you already applied shields to everyone, then using Emergency Tactics will make the next cast instead apply the amount of shields that should happen as more healing. Due to this ability's specific use case, it is not unusual to go a long time without using it at all. At level 60, you learn the ability Dissipation, a very unique ability which can be incredibly difficult to use. Using Dissipation removes access to your fairy, including both the automatic Embrace casts and access to any of her abilities. Your fairy returns automatically 30 seconds later. The advantage of using Dissipation is that it can grant you an extra set of 3 Aetherflows and also increases your healing from your spells for the duration that your fairy is not present. There are a few scenarios where Dissipation can be useful. Since Aetherflows can be spent for damage on energy drain, and doing so can be a damage output gain, this is an option. Just keep in mind that this strategy comes with a tremendous loss of potential healing. If your party or tank is about to die and you have no other way to save them except Aetherflow actions, you can use Dissipation for this. Just keep in mind that now that your fairy's passive healing is gone for a while, you will need to be doing the heavy lifting yourself on that front too. Just before the fight ends in a dungeon context, or just before a longer segment of downtime in a boss fight, use Dissipation to acquire the free Aetherflows. You can even use Adlocuium and Deployment Tactics to make use of the healing bonus. Keep in mind, Dissipation cannot be used unless you are in combat, hence why it has to be before the fight ends. At level 62, you learn the ability Excogitation, a trap buff Aetherflow spender. When the target drops below half health, or when the duration ends, which happens to be equal to the cooldown, the healing from the trap buff is applied. Unless you don't expect the tank to take much damage, you should typically apply this to the tank on cooldown. Make sure to play around it, not actively healing the tank up too much if Excogitation is on them. Keep in mind that if the target dies from a hit, then Excogitation will not bring them back up. In a raid context, it may be beneficial to use Excogitation in anticipation of a tank bust to ease the recovery afterwards. At level 64, Broil is upgraded to Broil 2. The potency of Ruin 2 is also increased slightly again, finally making it better than Art of War on single target. At level 66, you learn the ability Chain Stratagem, which is a raid cooldown that you apply to one enemy that improves the critical hit chance of everyone attacking the target. You should make use of this ability as close to on cooldown as you can. Apply it to the healthiest target in a pack of enemies, or use it on a boss. Keep in mind that if there is another Scholar present, this effect will not stack, so try to avoid using it at the same time. In a boss fight, it may be worth considering if the boss is about to be unattackable for a while, in which case it may be better to save this cooldown for after they return. At level 70, you learn the ability Aetherpact and unlock the Fairy Gauge. Every time you use Aetherflow actions while in combat and while your fairy is present, you gain 10 Fairy Gauge. Using Aetherpact on a target causes your fairy to channel a beam that does significantly more healing than Embrace every 3 seconds at the cost of 10 Fairy Gauge each time. While Aetherpact has a huge range, if your target should manage to get out of range during the channeling, your fairy will not move into range and will wait for them to get back in range unless you stop it. Running out of Fairy Gauge or using Aetherpact again while it is channeling will cancel it. Since you can choose who your fairy should focus on with Aetherpact, and the healing is quite potent, the typical target is the tank, although you can absolutely use it to help heal up any target that needs it after a big hit. Try your best to make use of the gauge so it doesn't sit at max. One way to go about making sure you don't sit at max is to aggressively spend down to 70 whenever you use Aetherflow, so you are guaranteed to be able to hold the Fairy Gauge produced by the Aetherflow you currently have. At level 72, Bio 2 upgrades to Biolysis, and Broil 2 upgrades to Broil 3. Ruin 2 also gains another small damage boost. For single target, this does not really change anything. However, in AoE pulls, I would recommend applying Biolysis to 3 or 4 targets while the tank is rounding up enemies, due to the very high potency of Biolysis. On 4 targets, Biolysis is better than Art of War if it lasts its full duration, which is most likely to happen if it is applied before the fight really begins. At level 74, you learn the ability Recitation, which when used, causes your next Adlocurium, Succor, Indomitability or Excogitation to both cost no resources and also guarantees that it will be a critical healing effect. Note that while Excogitation and Indomitability in this context will not spend Aetherflow, they will still produce Fairy Gauge. With so many ways to use it, let me come with some examples. If nothing else, you can use it with Excogitation, which almost always means that the activation of the Excogitation heal can nearly top off even the tank. This will also give you more Aetherflows to go around, making it easier to use Excogitation on cooldown, but at the same time have enough Aetherflow for your other options. If you need to recover your party after a large amount of damage, then Indomitability is definitely a best option. You can also use Recitation on Adlocurium and then use deployment tactics to guarantee a massive shield for everyone. I would only really recommend this if you know a massive attack is incoming. I would not recommend using Recitation on Succor in any scenario. Due to the power of Recitation, I highly recommend you try your best to find a use for it on cooldown, even if it is to use Excogitation on the tank. Only sit on it if you know you will need it for something specific really soon. At level 76, you learn the ability Fey Blessing, which is an instant AoE healing ability on a minute cooldown, cast by your fairy. You can heal your party for a decent amount with this ability, so make sure to use it regularly. At level 78, your Sacred Soil is upgraded to also apply heal over time for its duration. This healing amount alone makes it superior to Indomitability in raw healing. If your group is going to stay in it, Sacred Soil should be used as close to on cooldown as possible, of course only if players are going to benefit from the healing or the damage reduction. The damage reduction also makes it superior to Lust Rate in most cases, even if only a single target benefits. At level 80, you learn the ability Summon Seraph, which temporarily replaces your fairy with Seraph. Be aware that if you requested your fairy to use any abilities before this, and she has not performed them yet, she will forget them completely and you will not be refunded the cooldown. This issue is commonly known as ghosting. It should be noted that this also happens if you use Dissipation, but this is much less common. Seraph uses a superior version of Embrace called Seraphic Veil that adds a shield on top of the normal Embrace healing, shielding for the same amount, effectively doubling the power. You also learn the ability Consolation. When Seraph is present, the button to summon Seraph automatically changes to Consolation, and when used, this causes Seraph to heal everyone and apply a shield to them. You get up to 2 uses of Consolation per Seraph use, so make sure to make good use of them. If you are unsure of when to use them, it is not a bad idea to use one immediately once Seraph comes up, and then another as soon as the shield is spent on the tank. In the duration of Seraph, the existing fairy abilities are all replaced by Seraph's styled versions of the abilities. They don't get improved however, so you should try to make sure abilities like Whispering Dawn and even Aetherpact are not needed or are already spent for the duration of Summon Seraph. Summon Seraph seems like a huge cooldown that should only be used for the most desperate moments, but in reality, the cooldown is a relatively short 2 minutes for its incredible potential, so try to make regular use of it. At level 82, Broil 3 upgrades to Broil 4, Ruin 2 gets another small potency boost, and Art of War upgrades to Art of War 2. Again, this does not really change your single target rotation, but you should still consider applying Biolysis to 3 or 4 targets while the tank is rounding up enemies in an AoE scenario. On 3 targets, Biolysis is better than Art of War if it lasts at least 24 seconds. At level 85, Physic, Succor and Adlocuium get improved alongside your Fairy's Embrace and Seraph's Seraphic Veil. The shielding spells get improved on their shielding capabilities specifically. This does not exactly change much, as you will use them in exactly the same way. The likely biggest change you will feel is that your Fairy is suddenly more effective. At level 86, you learn the ability Protraction, which increases the healing received by your target for a few seconds. It also increases their health and heals them by that amount. 2 particularly useful ways to apply this ability is to use Excogitation or Adlocuium in the duration. Adlocuium will of course produce an even bigger shield, and Excogitation will benefit from the healing bonus, even if its healing component is activated later. The primary target of this ability is of course your tank. You can also combo Protraction with Recitation, Adlocuium and Deployment Tactics to make an even bigger shield. At level 88, Deployment Tactics cooldown is reduced. The main useful change here is that now the cooldown lines up perfectly with Recitation, in case you like to use it with Adlocuium. At level 90, you learn the ability Expedient, which reduces the damage taken by everyone in your party, stacking with Sacred Soil when relevant. It also applies a speed boost equivalent to Sprint in speed to everyone. In a dungeon context, this ability can be incredibly useful while your tank is pulling, or if someone is far out of position. In raids, this ability can be very helpful for dealing with mechanics with a lot of movement, but it will never be mandatory to use, since no other healer has access to a similar tool. Now, to round off, let's start with an attack opener and attacking tips. Then we talk about some tips and tricks to make the most of your cooldowns. These tips will be mostly focused on dungeons, as raids and trials tend to have a bigger focus on dealing with each mechanic individually, and often which tool is best for when can vary for each boss encounter. Finally, we touch on stat priorities. For the opener, keep in mind that this opener will focus on maximizing damage and that this comes at a significant loss on healing. If you are not in a coordinated group or are still progressing and practicing on a fight, then it may be wiser to skip the parts where I suggest using Energy Drain and Dissipation. 3 seconds before pull. If you intend to use a tincture, a so-called burst potion, this is the time. 1.5 seconds before pull, start casting Broil and then cast Biolysis while weaving Aetherflow. Then cast Broil 2 more times and then weave Chain Stratagem. This delay is intended to align Chain Stratagem with the rest of the potential raid buffs. After that, cast Broil and weave Energy Drain 3 times, assuming you won't need the Aetherflow for anything else. 1 more Broil and then weave Dissipation, again unless you need your Fairy. You can also swap the order of Aetherflow and Dissipation if it helps. Finish off the opener with 3 more Broils weaving Energy Drain. Remember, it is okay to save the Aetherflows if you will need them for healing options. After that, you repeatedly cast Broil 4 until something more important comes up. You can weave Recitation and then Excogitation over a couple GCDs for instance, but due to the simplicity of the Scholar's offensive toolkit, that is your opener. Now, for the healing tips section, a little spoiler warning. The footage that we'll be playing will be from one of the optional level 90 dungeons, so it will be mostly irrelevant to the main story, but some may still find this to be too spoilery. This footage will continue for the rest of the video, so if you want to avoid seeing it, you can choose to simply listen to the rest of the video or come back later once you feel safe doing so. While the tank is pulling, Start by making sure you are in combat by applying Biolysis to a target. Then use Recitation and Excogitation on the tank. Optionally, you can also use Protraction on the tank before that to increase the healing from Excogitation. After that, apply Biolysis to up to 4 targets and then move on to spamming Art of War. You can also apply Adlocurium to the tank before the pull even starts, either by being far enough ahead that you have the time to cast it, or by using Swift Cast. If the tank needs more healing while pulling, your best option is using Lustrade. If the tank's sprint runs out in the middle of pulling, you can also use Expedient to give them another speed boost. When the pull comes to a stop, place down Sacred Soil and, while spamming Art of War, plan out what tools you will use as the tank needs them. Remember that Excogitation typically will last a while at the start of a fight. Whispering Dawn heals for slightly less than Sacred Soil, but if applied as Sacred Soil ends, it can help blunt the incoming damage. Aetherpact can also help a lot, even if just for a couple of ticks of healing. Fey Blessing is also worth using if just for the tank's benefit, as the cooldown is short enough that you should have access to Fey Blessing at least once per pull. When all else fails, Summon Seraph is one of your strongest tools, but due to how it does not improve any of your regular fairy options, it is best to save Summon Seraph till after all these other options are spent. Keep in mind that using Summon Seraph may result in a moment of delay between fairy heals, and that while Seraph is strong, you need to use it before it is too late, as its power lies in consistent healing, not burst healing. For last resort burst healing, use Adlocurium and emergency tactics with Adlocurium to heal as much as you can. You can also use Lustrade in quick succession, but keep in mind that Adlocurium's cast time is too long to weave properly, so in this case it may be better to weave Lustrade between physic casts, whatever it takes. If Expedient is available, and your tank appears to try to make use of movement to reduce damage by kiting, then this can be life-saving too. Entering a boss fight. If your group is bunched up close enough together, you can use Swiftcast Adlocurium on the tank and then deployment tactics to make the possible first raid-wide attack do nothing. Make sure to apply Chain Stratagem as soon as possible. It could be on cooldown if you used it on a key target in an AoE pool previously, which is fine. Finally, regarding stat priorities. In almost every single case, item level is more important than the correct secondary stats, so always pick the gear piece with the higher item level and thus most mind on it. Next, Scholar likes the general critical hit, direct hit, determination priority. Critical hit scales better than the competition, and direct hit scales just as well as determination for damage. However, while determination boosts healing done as well, direct hit only boosts damage. Because direct hit is never found on healer gear, it is often higher value for melting than determination if you want to maximize damage. Piety is a stat unique to healers, and it increases the amount of mana you get from passive regeneration. If you feel like you run out of mana too early, make sure that you are using your job-specific regeneration tools often enough, and that you are not casting excessive amounts of expensive heals. If that still doesn't help, add more piety. Finally, spell speed. Spell speed will indeed increase your damage and healing, but it also increases the amount of mana you spend. Scholar can use spell speed, but won't need it, so you can get an amount of spell speed you like and leave it at that. Unless you do the hardest content in the game, it is not that important to have the perfect stats on your gear, as long as the item level on your gear matches the difficulty of the content. That is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or anything to add, please leave a comment down below. Fun fact, with the simplification of the summoner's pet mechanics, the Scholar is now the only job that really needs to make use of the pet action menu. This makes it even more important that you, as a Scholar, understand how it works. I go over this aspect in more detail in the level 30 to 50 guide if you are curious.